State of Oklahoma executes a convicted murderer in McAllister. Kendrick Simpson was executed by lethal injection at the state penitentiary just a few hours ago.
He smiled at his own execution. He admitted he pulled the trigger. He also spent 15 years becoming a poet. Both of those things are true. Both of those things belong to the same man. And on February 12, 2026, the state of Oklahoma executed them both. But we are not starting this story in the death chamber. We are starting it where Kendrick Antonio Simpson started, in New Orleans, Louisiana, in a housing project that the United States government had long since stopped pretending to care about. Kendrick grew up in one of the most economically distressed, violence-saturated environments in this country. That is not an excuse for what he eventually did. It is a context, and the law, in theory, requires that context to be examined before a life is taken. Whether it was examined properly in his case is one of the questions this story asks. In November 2004, before any of what would follow, Kendrick Simpson was a victim. He was shot 5 times in a drive-by shooting in New Orleans. 5 bullets entered his body. He survived, but he carried the physical and psychological wreckage of that with him for the rest of his life. His attorneys would later argue that he suffered from PTSD, not as an excuse, but as a documented clinical reality that they believed the jury that sentenced him to death had never fully understood. Then Katrina hit. In the summer of 2005, Hurricane Katrina made landfall and turned New Orleans into a catastrophe. The levees broke, the water rose, the people in the housing projects, the poorest, the most vulnerable, were left behind. Kendrick Simpson fled. He joined the mass displacement of hundreds of thousands of survivors and made his way to Oklahoma City. A man carrying 5 bullet wounds in his past, unprocessed trauma, and no stable infrastructure in a city that was not his own. A man who was, by his lawyer's later assessment, already suffering from a level of post-traumatic stress that should have been treated and never was. None of that makes what happened next acceptable. None of it erases what he did. But it is part of the story, and the story requires the whole truth. January 2006, Oklahoma City, a nightclub on the northwest side of the city. The kind of place where young men in their early 20s go on a Friday night to feel alive, to dance, to laugh, to be young in a way that feels like it will last forever. Glenn Palmer was 20 years old. Anthony Jones was 19. Say their names. Say them again. Because before we talk about the man who was executed, we are going to talk about the men who were murdered. They deserved to be 20 and 19 forever. They deserved every year they did not get. And they deserved better than what happened to them on that January night. According to prosecutors, and according to Kendrick Simpson's own eventual admission, there was an altercation at the club that night. Simpson and Glenn Palmer had a confrontation inside the venue. The details of that initial argument matter less than what came next, because what came next was not the heat of a moment, it was a decision. Before driving to that club, Simpson had placed an assault rifle in the trunk of his vehicle. Whether that rifle was there in anticipation of violence, or whether it was simply the way a man from the world he came from moved through a world that had already shot him 5 times, that is a question the trial never definitively answered. What is not a question is what he did with it. After the confrontation inside the club, Simpson and his companions followed Glenn Palmer and Anthony Jones. The 2 young men had left. They were in their car. They were near a gas station, just existing, moving, heading somewhere. And Kendrick Simpson pulled that assault rifle from the trunk, pointed it out of the window, and fired. He fired approximately 20 rounds into their car. 20 rounds into a vehicle, into the bodies of 2 teenagers, who had been alive and breathing and going home just minutes before. Both Glenn Palmer and Anthony Jones were hit multiple times. There was a 3rd man in the car with them. He survived, physically at least. What he carries from that night, no one can fully measure. Glenn Palmer and Anthony Jones did not survive. They were 19 and 20 years old. They had their whole lives in front of them. And in the space of a few seconds, the time it takes to pull a trigger 20 times, those lives were over. The car they were in became the last place they ever sat. The night they went out became the last night they ever had. Crystal Allison lost her brother Glenn that night. She has been living with that loss for 20 years. 20 years of grief, of absence, of holidays and milestones and ordinary Tuesdays that Glenn Palmer was not there for. And through all of it, through every stage of the legal process, through the trial and the sentencing and the decades on death row, she held on. She waited. She believed that one day justice would come. Kendrick Simpson was convicted of the double murder of Glenn Palmer and Anthony Jones. He was sentenced to death. And in the years that followed, the long, grinding, paper-heavy years of appeals and hearings and legal motions, something happened inside the Oklahoma State Penitentiary that nobody fully anticipated. Kendrick Simpson changed. His legal team described a transformation that they characterized as extraordinary. He became a reader, a thinker. He published poetry, actual published poetry, from inside his death row cell. He became someone his attorneys described as humble, empathetic, open, and deeply remorseful. They said he had developed qualities that many people who have never seen the inside of a prison never managed to develop. His attorneys wrote in his clemency application, "Kendrick is a man worthy of your mercy and compassion. The death penalty is supposed to be reserved for the worst of the worst offenses and offenders. Kendrick and his case represent neither." That is a significant statement, and it is one that the board ultimately did not accept. But here is something that needs to be said, something that Crystal Allison's story demands we say. Transformation, however genuine, does not undo murder. The poetry Kendrick Simpson published while on death row did not bring Glenn Palmer back to life. The remorse he expressed in his clemency hearing did not restore 19 years to Anthony Jones. The question of what a justice system should do with a man who has genuinely changed after committing profound violence is one of the hardest questions civilization grapples with. There is no clean answer. And the families of victims are not required to have one. For Crystal Allison, the question was simpler and more brutal than any philosophical debate. Her brother was dead. A man had killed him, and for 20 years, that man had still been alive, writing, thinking, growing, while Glenn Palmer existed only in memory. Whatever Kendrick Simpson became in those 20 years, he became it in a world that Glenn Palmer never got to be part of. That is the contradiction at the heart of this story, and it does not resolve cleanly. It was never going to. In January 2026, Kendrick Simpson stood before the Oklahoma Pardon and Parole Board for his final clemency hearing. This was the last formal opportunity for the state to step back from the execution, to weigh the totality of the man in front of them, and decide whether death was still the answer. Simpson spoke. He addressed the board, the victims' families, and the record directly. He did not hide behind mitigating factors. He did not reach for the PTSD diagnosis as a shield. He said the words that his lawyers told the world he had been saying for 15 years. "I don't make any excuses. I don't blame others, and they didn't deserve what happened to them." It is worth sitting with those words, because they are not the words of a man performing remorse for a board. By every account of those who had known him in prison, the attorneys, the advocates, the spiritual advisors, that admission had been consistent from the moment he first met his legal team in 2011. No deflection, no blame shifting, no attempt to make the crime someone else's fault. His defense argued the documented PTSD. They argued the childhood trauma in the New Orleans housing projects. They argued that the jury which sentenced him to death had not been given the full picture of who Kendrick Simpson was and what had shaped him. They argued that the death penalty, by its own stated standard, should be reserved for the worst of the worst, and that this case did not meet that threshold. The board voted, 5 members, the most consequential vote most of them would ever cast, 3-2, against clemency. By a margin of 1 vote, Kendrick Simpson's life was not spared. The decision passed to Governor Kevin Stitt, a man who had halted an execution just weeks earlier, at the very last minute, for a man named Tremaine Wood, a governor who had granted clemency only once in his tenure before that, in the high-profile Julius Jones case, a governor who had, by that point, overseen 16 executions. Stitt did not intervene. The execution date was confirmed, February 12, 2026. The morning of February 12th was not quiet. Outside the Oklahoma State Penitentiary in McAlester, demonstrators gathered. Death penalty abolitionists had been vocal throughout Simpson's case, raising concerns not just about this specific execution, but about the system itself, about the PTSD diagnosis that was never properly weighed, about the question of whether a 3-2 clemency vote was a sufficient margin to justify taking a life. About the broader reality that Oklahoma was moving forward with its first execution of 2026. At the governor's mansion, a prayer vigil began at 9 in the morning. People stood in the early February cold and prayed for Kendrick Simpson, for the victims, for a system that many believed was about to make an irreversible mistake. Inside the penitentiary, preparations were underway. Oklahoma uses a 3-drug protocol: midazolam, a sedative; vecuronium bromide, to stop breathing; potassium chloride, to stop the heart, a process designed to be clinical and controlled. It rarely feels that way to the people who witness it. Crystal Allison was inside the witness room. She had come to watch the man who killed her brother die. She had waited 20 years for this moment. She had prepared herself as much as any human being can prepare for witnessing an execution.
Just after 10
to
in the
finally
morning on
close
February
the chapter
12,
that had been
2026,
opened since January
Kendrick
2006,
Antonio Simpson
was brought into the death chamber at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary. He was strapped to a gurney. In the room with him were the witnesses, his family, members of his legal team, the family members of his victims, and his spiritual advisor, the Reverend Don Heath, who had been granted permission to be present. Reverend Heath stood in the chamber and read scripture aloud as the process began. It was the kind of grace that death chambers are rarely filled with. Strapped to that gurney, Kendrick Simpson looked at the people who had come to support him, his family, his legal team, and he spoke. "I love y'all. Thank y'all for being here to support me." Those were his final words, words of love, words of gratitude, the last communication of a man saying goodbye to the people who had stood by him through 15 years behind bars. And then, according to the witnesses in that room, according to Crystal Allison, he smiled. The smile, not at the room in general, not at the ceiling. He smiled at his family. It was the natural expression of a man sharing a final moment of warmth with the people he loved. But Crystal Allison, watching from the witness gallery, did not experience it as warmth. She experienced it as the same expression that had followed her through 20 years of grief. She said afterward, in the words that have since traveled across the internet and into the consciousness of everyone who has followed this story, "The same smile that had been tormenting me for 20 years, he still smiled that same smile, laying on his deathbed." Sit inside it for a moment. Crystal Allison had carried that smile in her memory for 2 decades. It had lived in her dreams, her quiet moments, the spaces between ordinary life where grief creeps in and refuses to leave. She had come to that execution chamber expecting something different at the end, expecting, perhaps, contrition made visible, fear, something that would tell her that the man who killed her brother understood, in his bones, the magnitude of what he had taken. What she got was the smile. Whether Kendrick Simpson meant that smile as defiance or warmth, or simply the expression of a man saying goodbye to his family in the only way he knew how, that will never be resolved. He cannot be asked. He is gone. What can be said is this: Crystal Allison's experience of that moment was real. Her trauma was real. Her 20 years of waiting were real. And the fact that even the end, the moment she had anchored her hope to, did not give her what she needed, is one of the most devastating realities this story holds. The drugs began to flow. Approximately 5 minutes after the first medication was administered, a doctor entered the chamber and declared Kendrick Simpson unconscious. The Reverend Don Heath continued to read scripture. 12 minutes after the process began, Kendrick Antonio Simpson was pronounced dead. The time was 10:19 in the morning. Oklahoma Attorney General Gentner Drummond released a statement. "Justice has been served for Palmer and Jones. Their young lives were taken tragically and far too soon. I hope today brings some measure of peace to their families who have endured unimaginable pain for the past 20 years." Crystal Allison had wanted peace. She had waited for it. She had built her hope around its arrival. What she got instead was the knowledge that the smile, the one she had carried for 20 years, was now the last thing she would ever see on his face. She was not ready for that. She is still processing it. This is the part where true crime stories often wrap things up neatly. Justice served, case closed, the villain gone, the victims remembered. A bow on the end of a tragedy that never should have happened. We are not going to do that. Because what this story reveals is that justice, real justice, the kind that actually heals, is far more complicated than an execution date. Glenn Palmer was 20 years old, Anthony Jones was 19. They are gone. They have been gone since January 2006. No execution changes that. No execution brings them to the table for Christmas. No lethal injection gives Crystal Allison her brother back for a single afternoon. The absence is permanent, and it was created the moment Kendrick Simpson pulled that trigger. Kendrick Simpson is also gone now. Executed. Whether that execution served justice, or simply extended the cycle of violence in a different and state-sanctioned form, is a question that thoughtful people answer differently. His legal team released a statement after the execution. They wrote, "Today, the state of Oklahoma took the life of Kendrick Simpson. His manner of death will be recorded as homicide, a stark and undeniable truth. In the name of justice, the state chose to extend the cycle of trauma rather than end it. The Attorney General called it justice served. The defense team called it the extension of trauma. Crystal Allison called it a smile that still torments her. The three of them were all in the same room, watching the same event, and they all experienced something different. That is the reality of what the death penalty actually produces. Not closure, not clean endings, not resolution. It produces the end of a life, and the continuation of the grief that surrounds it." Oklahoma's first execution of 2026 was the second in the United States that year, part of an ongoing national story in which 47 people were executed in 2025 alone, the highest number since 2009. 26 men and 1 woman remain on Oklahoma's death row as of this writing. Each of them has a case. Each of their victims has a Crystal Allison. Each story contains the same impossible weight. What do we do with all of that weight? What does justice actually require when 2 young men are shot 20 times in a car by a man who is himself a victim of violence, who suffered documented trauma, who spent 15 years transforming in a cell, and who died with a smile on his face that his victim's sister will carry for the rest of her life? There is no clean answer. Anyone who tells you there is not telling you the truth. What we can do, what we must do, is say their names. Glenn Palmer, 20 years old. Anthony Jones, 19 years old. They deserved everything they didn't get. Every year, every moment, every ordinary day that Kendrick Simpson's 20 rounds of gunfire took from them. They deserved a future, and that future was ended for them in January 2006 on a highway in Oklahoma City by a man who admitted he had no excuse. Crystal Allison sat in a witness room and watched the man who killed her brother die. She had waited 20 years. She had built her grief around that moment, and when it came, the man on the gurney looked at his family and smiled. The same smile that had followed her through every one of those 20 years. She was not ready for that. She may never be fully ready for what that moment cost her. This case is closed in the legal sense. There will be no more hearings, no more appeals, no more clemency votes. Kendrick Simpson will write no more poetry. Glenn Palmer and Anthony Jones have been dead for 20 years. But for Crystal Allison, and for the family of Anthony Jones, and for every person connected to this story, the case does not close. It continues in the way all violent loss continues. Quietly, persistently, in the spaces between ordinary life where grief lives and refuses to be scheduled. What we owe them, all of them, is the honesty to sit with the full complexity of what happened, not to reduce it to a villain and a hero, not to reduce it to a simple triumph of justice or a simple failure of mercy, but to hold the whole truth that 2 young men were murdered, that a man with a documented history of trauma made a choice that ended their lives, that he spent 20 years in a cell becoming someone different, that the state decided that was not enough, and that a woman sat in a witness room and watched the end of it all, and left that room still carrying the weight she came in with. Justice is supposed to lift that weight. It is supposed to, at the very least, acknowledge it and honor it, and give the people carrying it something solid to stand on. On February 12th, 2026, the state of Oklahoma gave Crystal Allison a closed casket and a smile. The rest, the peace, the healing, the closure, she will have to find on her own. If this story made you think, if it made you feel, then do something with that feeling. Like and subscribe to Behind the Crime Tape. We tell the stories that demand to be told, completely, honestly, with every complication intact and every victim's name spoken with the weight it deserves. We don't simplify. We don't clean up. We don't give you easy answers when the real answers are hard. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a case. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. And drop a comment. Tell us what you think justice actually looks like in a case like this. We read every single one. Glenn Palmer, Anthony Jones, Crystal Allison, Kendrick Simpson. All of them are part of this story.